What questions or problems are you working to solve?
So in the US, in our entire economy, 1 out of every $6 is spent on healthcare. It's a lot of money, and half those dollars come from public monies. So Medicare, Medicaid, the VA health system, children's health programs, those are coming from tax dollars. And then the other half is coming from the private sector, private health insurance, out of pocket. This is coming out of people's paychecks, essentially. So it's a lot of money, and every single dollar could have been spent somewhere else, if not in the healthcare system. It could have been spent on education or housing or transportation, or in the case of private health spending or public health spending, it could go back in the paycheck in the form of lower taxes, higher wages, and even inside the healthcare system, what we spend on, if we spend on one health service, means we're not spending on a different health service that we decided not to spend on. So there's opportunity cost. Every dollar we spend in the healthcare system, it's a large amount of money. The amount of money we spend in the US healthcare system would be, if I have the numbers right, the entire GDP of the German economy. It'd be the 5th largest country. Just the spending on healthcare would represent the GDP of the 5th largest country in terms of GDP per capita. Or actually, no, sorry, GDP total spending. So the question I'm trying to help solve or shed light on is, are we getting good value for the money we spend in healthcare? Are the buys we're making producing sufficient gains in health compared to how much we're spending? And to do this, I use a method called cost effectiveness analysis that attempts to quantify bang for buck in healthcare spending. So what's high value spending, what's low value spending? What cost effectiveness aims to do is to assess, categorize, rank services, interventions, policies, drugs, laboratory tests, technologies, surgeries, anything you can think of in the healthcare system. It tries to put a bang for buck number on that to put a little quantitative evidence, some numbers to whether that's high value spending or low value spending.
Why have you chosen to pursue this question or problem?
One of the reasons I chose to work on this problem is that I love the logic and the math behind it. I like the structured way of thinking about difficult problems where there are trade-offs. I get kind of intellectually engaged when there's not an obvious right course of action. So when there's let's say in health, when there's a intervention that is clearly better on the health side than the alternative. So it does a better job of curing the disease, and it has less side effects than the status quo. And this new intervention costs less money, and it averts really expensive, bad health consequences down the road. That's great for society. I think those are the kinds of interventions we would strive for, I think, to have and to create. But as a decision scientist, that's my job. It's kind of a boring problem because we know what to do. Hey, fund that intervention. There's no trade-off. It's great. Let's do it. Let's mobilize people to use that. The problem in reality, in practice, is that there are very few clear winners like that in healthcare. And I would probably argue in general, trade-offs are bound everywhere. Sometimes there's an intervention that does better on curing the disease or preventing the disease, but there's a side effect that comes along with it. Maybe there's a trade-off between length of life and quality of life, or maybe there's a trade-off between the health gains that are captured and the costs it takes to get those. So it's a health improving but very costly intervention. What do we do in those situations? That's where cost effectiveness and the methods that I use and we use in our field are coming to use. They can at least quantify the trade-offs and tell you, here's how much you're giving up on this dimension in order to gain in this other dimension. And how do we feel about that as decision makers? Again, when all the money we're spending could go back to people in the form of lower taxes or higher wages, or could be spent in other sectors like education, defense, transportation, things that we also think of as valuable in society. So that is motivating to me, that there are these tough problems. We could use math that could be, it can get complicated, but it could also come back to fairly simple quantitative principles at the same time for some problems. And ways of thinking about these problems. That's, I think, intellectually interesting to me, and it makes me feel like some of the work that we do can help shed light on these important problems.
As individuals and collectively as a society, what can we do to help answer the questions or solve these problems?
So we need a lot of help as decision scientists. On the research side, or let's say the content side, producing these types of analyses, we're often not the ones generating the data, but we are the ones using data that have already been estimated and synthesizing them in a formal decision model. That's where our role comes in with the math. And so we do rely on the general research community and community even more broadly to create results and data and data sets that are available for us to use. So the open science movement has been very helpful for our field as decision scientists, because we're often not collecting primary data, we're using data that's already out there. And so to the extent that data are made available and free or through collaboration, that helps us a lot. That's on the kind of data generation, or the generation of these kinds of analyses. That's on that side. On the consumption of and the usefulness, let's say, or translation of decision analyses, cost effectiveness analyses, I would say these issues can get very political and even sometimes emotional. And a lot of times decision makers or citizens or folks will kind of have a preferred policy in mind and are just looking for arguments to support the thing they like. And I think the decision scientist or the cost effectiveness researcher is looking for actually tough problems where we don't know where the right answer is. And we're just capturing a couple of elements to the problem. Length of life, quality of life, and cost are the typical dimensions. And we're trying to put numbers behind them to show bang for buck. This doesn't completely solve the problem. You'll notice equity and distributional consequences weren't in what I just described. Severity of the disease is not given special weight, though it is indirectly captured. Dignity of the patient, I didn't mention. There are a lot of factors that we don't consider. Political feasibility. So then there's a tension that some of these missing elements, critics of cost effectiveness analysis will say, well, it's not solving our problem. It's not giving us any kind of ultimate solution. Throw it in the garbage. And then on the other hand, there are folks, some in my field, who believe in the method so much that they refuse to consider anything aside from a cost effectiveness analysis. They'll say the numbers are the most objective things we have, and budgets are limited, and we can only make decisions based on the cost effectiveness recommendations. And what I would ask us in general, as decision makers, as researchers, as people who pay taxes and pay health insurance premiums, is just appreciate that cost effectiveness analysis is adding some quantification to some dimensions of the problem into this overall decision-making process. And that can be helpful sometimes, especially when there are these tough trade-offs, but it doesn't have to be the final solution. There are absolutely reasons one might want to deviate from a cost effectiveness result. And I've written a little bit about why we might want to fund a so-called cost ineffective intervention, maybe because of ethics, or actually it's a small part of spending, it's not breaking the budget, it's okay. Or a couple of other reasons that I can't remember off the top of my head, but you could Google that and find that. I think, but just this open mind around tough decision problems in the healthcare space where there are trade-offs between cost and health, cost effectiveness analysis, I think is a useful bang for buck. It's just kind of one piece of information that we could use to help make this tough decision. And that's what I would hope that the community kind of appreciates when consuming the results of these kinds of analyses.